It finally happened. San Antonio and Jeremy Sochan went their separate ways. Not at the trade deadline like most of us expected, but a little later and in a much more definitive way because the Spurs waived him. The separation felt inevitable for weeks or even months. Around the deadline, the signals were already there, but nothing materialized. Trade didn't happen, and Sochan stayed. But not for long, and now it's official. I made a full breakdown of his situation before the deadline, so I won't repeat every detail, but the timeline matters. The Spurs drafted him really high, 9th overall in 2022. He arrived raw, very raw, with a limited offensive skill set and a jumper that looked like it was still under construction, yet the organization clearly believed the defensive instincts, motor, and physical profile were worth betting on long-term. And to their credit, they didn't hesitate. They gave him minutes immediately. In his first 2 seasons, Sochan played a lot, sometimes through mistakes that would have benched other young players on different teams, and defensively he became one of the tone setters. Greg Popovich experimented constantly, sometimes in ways that looked almost reckless from the outside, but the intention was clear: force him into uncomfortable roles and accelerate growth. The most extreme example was the point guard experiment in his second year, when Sochan was handed on-ball responsibilities he simply wasn't ready for. And the result was historically bad in the short term. The Spurs set a franchise record for consecutive losses. Yet the organization treated that stretch as developmental tuition rather than failure. At the beginning of his 3rd season, it actually seemed like something was clicking. He was playing the best basketball of his Spurs tenure, more decisive, more confident, less hesitant with the ball. But then the injuries started stacking up. Rehab, return, rhythm lost, another setback. The entire season became fragmented, and when Mitch Johnson's rotation stabilized later on, Jeremy was no longer a guaranteed starter. That shift mattered more than it looked at the time. Heading into the summer of 2025, before his 4th season, the situation was simple. If he wanted his starting role back on a team that was clearly transitioning from development to contention, he needed real offensive growth, especially as a reliable 3-point shooter. Sochan spent a lot of time in the gym, but unfortunately he never showed any real noticeable jump in his game, and eventually he found himself stuck at the far end of the bench. A few weeks before the trade deadline, rumors started circulating that the Spurs weren't planning to offer him an extension and were logically exploring trade options for Jeremy. It made sense from a roster-building standpoint, but the problem was simple. There wasn't a good deal on the table. The name that kept coming up most often was a potential trade with the Knicks involving French power forward Guerschon Yabusele. But in the end, San Antonio decided not to move forward with it. The deadline passed, Sochan stayed, yet his role didn't magically reappear. There still wasn't a place for him in the rotation. He didn't really fit this new version of the Spurs, primarily because of his limited offensive skill set, and there was no real point in keeping him glued to the bench for the rest of the season. So, waiving Jeremy now is, in a way, a sign of respect from the organization. They're giving him the opportunity to find a new team immediately instead of waiting until the summer, to prove himself in a different environment and potentially secure a much bigger contract down the line. Let's be honest, over the years Jeremy was given plenty of chances to develop, more than the average young NBA player typically receives. But overall, he didn't make the kind of progress that would allow him to become a reliable piece on a true contender. While the team as a whole took a major step forward and turned into one of the main title contenders already this season, Jeremy more or less stayed at the same level. At some point, it's healthier to close the chapter. The Spurs are building a modern, positionless kind of roster where everyone is expected to defend, shoot, and rebound. That's just where today's NBA is headed. If you want to be a real contender, you can't really afford to carry a tiny, non-athletic point guard who gets hunted every possession, or a one-dimensional wing who only shoots and does nothing else, or a big man who clogs the lane because he can't space the floor. There are exceptions, sure, especially at center because elite size still bends the rules a little. But the overall direction of the league is obvious. Versatility isn't a luxury anymore, it's the baseline. And every player has to hold up across multiple areas of the game without becoming a liability somewhere obvious. I honestly never thought I'd say this, but on this particular point, I actually agree with Gilbert Arenas.
And I've always said, defensive players, and that's all they do, they are a liability on the team. The liability is not the offensive player that can't play defense. It's the defensive player that can't play offense.
The benefits for the player to say goodbye is clear, and Jeremy already managed to find a new team yesterday. But from the Spurs' perspective, there are practical benefits too. First of all, there's simply no real logic in keeping a frustrated player on the roster when his role has effectively disappeared. Secondly, the Spurs opened up a roster spot, which gives them flexibility heading into the final stretch of the season and potentially access to the buyout market. There isn't an obvious perfect candidate right now, and I'm not completely convinced San Antonio will rush into a signing just for the sake of activity, but having the option itself is valuable. Bringing in an experienced veteran, even someone projected for limited minutes near the back end of the rotation, can matter in the playoffs, where depth, composure, and situational awareness often decide games more than raw talent does. And even if they ultimately choose not to sign anyone, this Spurs team remains deep, with multiple internal solutions already on the roster. Most notably, there is a player at the same position as Sochan who provides comparable defensive impact, offers a more reliable perimeter shot, and is younger. Yep, you probably already got it. I'm talking about Carter Bryant, who's been on fire over the last couple of weeks. And it's not even just about the numbers ticking up in the recent games, although that part obviously matters too. It's more about what he's actually showing on the floor, the way he moves, the confidence in his decisions, the impact that goes beyond the box score. I'm not going to run through a full highlight reel of Carter. There's really no point in that. One short 30-second stretch from the last game against Dallas is more than enough, because that sequence alone pretty much sums up the kind of player Bryant is and what he's bringing to this team right now.
Hops. Oh, man, Hops. I mean, my goodness, man. A little late to the party, but it was still looking good. And can he knock it in the corner? Yeah, it goes down. Okay, Michael, look, not just a jumper. I'm not a high flyer. I got a little splash in my game. I got a J. Flag. It rotates to Christie, blocked by Bryant. CB doing everything. Cornette.
So in the end, this isn't about blame or disappointment. It's about timing and direction. Jeremy gave this team energy, defensive edge, personality. And for a couple of years, he represented the messy, experimental phase of a franchise trying to figure itself out. For that, he deserves respect. But the Spurs are no longer experimenting. They're refining, sharpening the rotation, tightening the margins, and thinking about May and June instead of draft odds. And when a team evolves, not everyone evolves at the same speed with it. So thank you, Jeremy, genuinely. But this separation makes basketball sense. The Spurs are moving forward, and they already have new names stepping into the light. New pieces that fit the blueprint of what this team is becoming. The story doesn't stall here, it just turns the page.